names in history evoke such immediate and visceral dread as Adolf Hitler. His legacy is stained with the blood of millions, forever synonymous with genocide, war, and the darkest recesses of human cruelty. In the decades since his death, Hitler has not only remained a historical figure, but has evolved into a symbol of absolute evil. In theological discussions, psychological analyses, and cultural portrayals, he is frequently likened to the devil, a monster, or more provocatively, a demon. But what does this really mean? Can a man be so vile, so destructive, that he ceases to be human in the moral imagination of humanity? The question, is Hitler really a demon? Is not a literal inquiry into horns and hellfire. Rather, it is a philosophical and symbolic question and exploration of how humanity processes radical evil. In religious traditions, demons are described as malevolent supernatural beings, agents of chaos, sin, and destruction. They are said to possess people, corrupt their minds, and draw them toward acts that defy divine morality. When Hitler is labeled a demon, it raises a deeper query. Was he merely a man corrupted by ideology and power? Or did he embody something darker, something that transcends human evil into metaphysical horror? This video explores that question through multiple lenses: historical, psychological, spiritual, philosophical, and cultural. We will examine who or what a demon is across religious and mythological traditions, and whether Hitler fits that archetype. We will analyze his life, decisions, and ideologies that led to mass murder and devastation. We will explore the Nazi regime's flirtation with the occult, and whether there is any spiritual or symbolic basis for associating Hitler with demonic influence. We will look at his psychological profile through modern psychiatry and reflect on whether mental illness or free will played the dominant role in his descent into darkness. Furthermore, this video will explore how society uses myth and metaphor to grapple with evil that feels too immense to be human. In calling Hitler a demon, are we seeking to understand him or to distance ourselves from the idea that such evil could reside in a fellow human being? What does this label say about our fears, our faith, and our failure to prevent such atrocities? Ultimately, the video does not seek to answer the question with a simple yes or no. Instead, it aims to unravel the complex intersections of morality, symbolism, and human nature that have caused Hitler to be remembered not just as a tyrant, but as the personification of evil itself. Whether he was a man possessed by ideology, madness, or metaphorical demons, the exploration of this question forces us to confront not only the horrors of history, but the depths of darkness within the human soul. Throughout history, the concept of a demon has existed in nearly every culture, taking on varied forms and meanings. While popular culture often depicts demons as horned beasts or terrifying apparitions, their origins are far more nuanced. To evaluate whether Adolf Hitler can be considered a demon, we must first examine the definition and nature of demons in religious doctrines, mythologies, and symbolic interpretations. In Christian theology, demons are considered fallen angels, cast out of heaven with Lucifer after rebelling against God. These beings are said to roam the earth, tempting, corrupting, and sometimes possessing humans. Their goal is often portrayed as the undoing of divine order, the sowing of chaos, and the destruction of souls. The Christian Bible describes them as invisible entities who oppose God's will and align with Satan. Their power is spiritual, not physical, and their influence is often subtle, entering through fear, hatred, pride, or desire for power. In Islam, demons are known as jinn beings created from smokeless fire. While not all jinn are evil, some, such as Iblis, Satan, rebelled against God and vowed to lead humans astray. Like Christian demons, evil jinn can possess individuals, whisper thoughts into their hearts, known as waswasa, and influence decisions that lead to harm and destruction. In Hinduism, beings similar to demons are called asuras, often depicted as power-hungry, prideful, and eternal conflict with the devas, divine beings. Asuras represent chaos, ignorance, and destructive passions, which can overtake the mind and lead to tyranny and cruelty. From these traditions, a common thread emerges. Demons are entities of intense negativity, often non-human, who influence or consume individuals, leading them to commit acts of great evil. They thrive on control, destruction, ego, and opposition to moral or cosmic order. Beyond formal theology, demons appear in countless mythologies and folk traditions. In ancient Mesopotamia, Lamashtu was a female demon who preyed on pregnant women and infants. In Japanese folklore, Oni are horned ogres who punish the wicked or terrorize villages. In African, Slavic, and Native American cultures, demons are sometimes spirits of the dead, nature spirits turned malevolent, or entities that reflect a community's collective fears. In these stories, demons serve as archetypes of unrestrained power, wrath, revenge, and madness. They are cautionary figures warning listeners against temptation, pride, or moral decay. When applied to real-life figures like Hitler, this mythological lens elevates them to the level of cultural nightmares, transforming their deeds into symbols of timeless evil. The term demon has also evolved into a metaphor for inner turmoil. In psychology, people speak of battling personal demons, depression, addiction, trauma, or destructive impulses. This framing acknowledges the internal forces that can drive human behavior without invoking the supernatural. Philosophers such as Carl Jung saw demons not as literal beings, but as aspects of the human shadow, repressed parts of the psyche that, if not acknowledged, manifest destructively. When people project evil outward, labeling someone like Hitler a demon, they may be grappling with their inability to comprehend such darkness within the scope of normal human psychology. To ask whether Hitler was a demon requires an understanding of the distinction between literal belief and symbolic association. Those who believe in actual supernatural demons might argue that Hitler was possessed or influenced by dark spiritual forces. This view is especially prevalent in religious or esoteric circles, which see Hitler's unnatural charisma, persuasive speech, and genocidal hatred as signs of something beyond human. On the other hand, the metaphorical approach views Hitler as a man whose actions were so monstrous and methodical that they transcended what we expect from human behavior, becoming demonic in scale and nature. His ability to manipulate millions, erase empathy, and architect genocide makes him a fitting candidate for symbolic demonization. In this context, calling Hitler a demon isn't a literal claim, it's a judgment of moral horror. Demons, whether spiritual beings, mythological figures, or psychological metaphors, represent forces of chaos, cruelty, and corruption. Across traditions and beliefs, they are seen as destroyers of harmony and violators of divine or moral law. Understanding this concept is essential before applying it to historical figures like Hitler. As we proceed, we must ask, does Hitler's life and actions fit this archetype? Or was he a man terrifying, yes, but entirely human in his cruelty? If we are to evaluate whether Adolf Hitler qualifies as a demon literally or symbolically, it is essential to examine the facts of his life, rise to power, and the atrocities for which he is responsible. While theological or symbolic arguments may explain how society perceives him, the foundation for such interpretations lies in the historical reality of his decisions and their consequences. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, Austria. His early life, while marked by a strict father and academic struggles, did not suggest the magnitude of evil he would later unleash. However, key events in his youth shaped his worldview: rejection from art school, exposure to German nationalism, and his experiences during World War I, where he served as a soldier and became deeply disillusioned with post-war Germany. It was during the post-war chaos of the 1920s, characterized by hyperinflation, humiliation after the Treaty of Versailles, and a broken Weimar Republic, that Hitler began crafting his identity as a savior figure. His writings in Mein Kampf laid out a clear and horrifying blueprint, a vision of a racially pure Germany, anti-Semitic conspiracies, and a belief in the supremacy of the so-called Aryan race. Though many dismissed him in his early political career, Hitler's rhetorical skill, intense charisma, and exploitation of fear and economic instability brought him rising support. In 1933, he was appointed Chancellor of Germany and soon after consolidated dictatorial power. If Hitler's name is synonymous with anything, it is the Holocaust, the systematic genocide of over 6 million Jews, alongside Romani people, disabled individuals, Poles, Slavs, communists, LGBTQ people, and other so-called undesirables. This was not the act of a sudden rage or isolated conflict. It was a cold, bureaucratic extermination that unfolded over years, meticulously planned through laws, ghettos, forced labor, concentration camps, and death factories like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. What makes Hitler's role particularly horrifying is the degree of deliberate calculation. He did not simply allow others to kill, he ordered it, he inspired it. He created the ideological framework that dehumanized entire populations, branding them as subhuman, and justified their destruction as necessary for the survival of the Aryan race. Documents, speeches, and testimonies confirm that Hitler was not merely a figurehead, he was a hands-on architect of genocide. He signed orders, gave directives, and maintained unwavering commitment to the final solution, even as the war turned against Germany. If the definition of a demon includes a being that thrives on destruction and suffering, Hitler's orchestration of the Holocaust stands as undeniable evidence of such a role, regardless of whether one believes in the supernatural. Hitler's hunger for expansion and dominance led directly to World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, claiming the lives of 85 million people, roughly 3% of the world's population at that time. Driven by his desire for Lebensraum, living space, he launched an aggressive campaign of invasion and conquest, first into Poland, then France, Norway, the Soviet Union, and beyond. His disregard for human life, both military and civilian, was staggering. Entire cities were bombed into ruins. Civilian populations were starved, enslaved, or massacred. His troops committed war crimes across Europe. In the Soviet Union, rape, looting, forced labor, and mass executions were routine. The Eastern Front in particular was marked by a policy of total brutality, where the only rule was destruction. What elevates this beyond the tragedy of war is the ideological nature of Hitler's violence. These weren't just tactical decisions, they were rooted in a belief that certain races and people were destined to be eradicated, a concept chillingly close to the religious definition of a demon, a being that destroys for pleasure, ideology, or metaphysical intent. One of Hitler's most disturbing achievements was his ability to manipulate an entire nation. Using propaganda, mass rallies, and speeches delivered with near-religious fervor, Hitler fostered an environment where truth became malleable and cruelty became virtue. He created a cult of personality, positioning himself as Germany's only hope. Children were indoctrinated through the Hitler Youth, literature was censored, and dissent was brutally suppressed. The Nazi regime used fear, myth, and spectacle to create a society where millions participated in or were complicit with his crimes. This ability to bend the human will is often attributed to demonic figures in religious texts: Satan tempting Eve, Mephistopheles corrupting Faust. The idea that one man could so profoundly reshape morality that murder seemed righteous and hatred seemed noble is perhaps one of the most chilling aspects of his legacy. Adolf Hitler died by suicide on April 30th, 1945, in his Berlin bunker. By that time, Germany was in ruins, and the full extent of Nazi crimes was being uncovered. Yet even in death, his influence did not end. Neo-Nazi groups, white supremacists, and other hate-driven ideologies continue to invoke his name and philosophy, proof that his spiritual and psychological poison still lingers. The Nuremberg trials revealed the depths of Nazi evil in disturbing detail, with first-hand accounts, film reels, and survivor testimonies. These records ensure that history never forgets, and they form the bedrock of the argument that Hitler was not just a war criminal, but something far more insidious. In purely historical terms, Adolf Hitler was a man whose vision of the world was built on blood, fire, and racial hatred. He enacted policies that led to the deliberate extermination of millions, plunged the world into chaos, and reshaped morality through manipulation and fear. While there is no need to invoke the supernatural to explain his actions, the scale, intentionality, and philosophical depth of his evil are so profound that it becomes understandable, even inevitable, that people turn to the word demon to describe him. Whether he was a literal demon is a matter of belief, but in the court of human history, he stands as one of the most demonic figures to have ever walked the earth. The suggestion that Adolf Hitler may have been influenced or even empowered by dark spiritual forces is not a fringe theory confined to conspiracy corners. It is a widely discussed, if controversial, idea in historical, religious, and even pop cultural contexts. Hitler's relationship with religion was complex. Publicly, he often portrayed himself as a Christian, a strategy to appeal to Germany's largely Christian population. However, his private remarks, particularly in Hitler's Table Talk, reveal a deep contempt for Christianity, which he considered weak, pacifistic, and incompatible with the Nazi ideal of power and domination. Yet Hitler was not a rational atheist either. He often spoke in mythical and quasi-religious terms, portraying himself as a messianic figure destined to save the German people. He frequently referenced fate, providence, and the idea of an eternal struggle between light and darkness, language more akin to religious prophecy than political rhetoric. He once declared, "We are not merely fighting Bolsheviks. We are waging a battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness." Such phrasing has led some scholars to question whether Hitler viewed himself as a chosen vessel of some larger cosmic or spiritual force, and whether that force was benevolent or malevolent. To understand the occult associations with Hitler, one must look at the broader esoteric roots of the Nazi Party. Before and during Hitler's rise, Germany was a hub of occult societies, mysticism, and pseudoscientific racial theories. A secretive German occult group, the Tool Society, played a key role in the early formation of the Nazi Party. Founded on a mix of Aryan mythology, anti-Semitism, and occult rituals, Tool believed in a mystical origin of the Aryan race from a lost civilization, sometimes equated with Atlantis or Hyperborea. Hitler was reportedly introduced to several key Nazi figures through Tool connections, including Rudolf Hess and Dietrich Eckart, the latter of whom is said to have believed Hitler was a messianic, mystical figure. Eckart famously wrote before his death, "Follow Hitler. He will dance, but it is I who have called the tune. We have given him the means of communication with them. Do not mourn for me. I shall have influenced history more than any other German." The reference to them has long been interpreted as supernatural or demonic entities. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, was an open admirer of paganism, astrology, and Germanic myth. He established Wewelsburg Castle as a cultic center, where rituals based on ancient Teutonic lore and runes were conducted. The SS was restructured with quasi-religious ceremonies, black uniforms designed to evoke power and mystery, and insignia, like the Death's Head skull and Twin Sig runes, pulled directly from esoteric and magical symbology. Some researchers claim Himmler tried to resurrect ancient Germanic gods, and that the SS operated almost like a religious order, with Hitler as its high priest or even divine figure. Whether this belief was sincere or delusional, it created an environment deeply entwined with symbolic and spiritual darkness. Over time, both enemies and followers of Hitler attributed supernatural characteristics to him. Reports during World War II described him as possessing an uncanny charisma and hypnotic power over crowds. His speeches were known to induce trance-like states in listeners, and even foreign observers commented on the almost possessed intensity of his delivery. Some believed Hitler was demonically guided, citing his ability to manipulate, deceive, and radicalize the masses through fear and fascination. Propaganda films like Triumph of the Will, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, were visually crafted to depict Hitler not as a man, but as a godlike or metaphysical force descending upon Germany to bring salvation or destruction. Post-war spiritualists and Christian demonologists occasionally claimed Hitler was either possessed, guided by demonic spirits, or an incarnation of evil sent to test mankind. Though unverifiable, such interpretations have persisted in religious discussions and paranormal literature. One of the most disturbing connections between Hitler and the concept of literal demonic possession appears in the infamous 1970s exorcism of Anneliese Michel, the young German woman whose story inspired the film The Exorcism of Emily Rose. During her documented exorcisms, Anneliese allegedly claimed to be possessed by multiple entities, including Lucifer, Nero, Judas, Cain, and Adolf Hitler. While critics argue that her claims were shaped by religious delusions and mental illness, the idea that Hitler's spirit could be one of the possessing demons adds a chilling layer to the notion that he became more than just a man in death, an evil spirit, a lingering demonic presence. It's crucial to differentiate between historical facts and later mythologizing. While there is undeniable evidence that members of Hitler's inner circle were obsessed with the occult, and that Nazi ideology was laced with esoteric symbolism, there is no definitive proof that Hitler performed rituals, summoned spirits, or believed he was possessed. However, the imagery, language, and belief systems surrounding him created a political movement that resembled a dark religion, complete with sacred texts, Mein Kampf, relics, the swastika, holy sites, Nuremberg rallies, and ultimate sacrifice, mass martyrdom of the German people. Whether or not demons were involved, Hitler constructed a regime that behaved as if it were under demonic influence, glorifying death, hating compassion, and seeking destruction as transcendence. The connection between Hitler and the occult is a murky but undeniable part of history. While scholars debate the extent of his belief in supernatural forces, the evidence points to a regime steeped in ritual, myth, and symbolic darkness. Whether Hitler was a willing puppet of spiritual evil, or simply a man who wielded myth as a weapon, remains uncertain. But the eerie spiritual undertones of his rule have led many to believe that he was not just evil, but possessed by it in a very real sense. The question of whether Adolf Hitler was mentally ill, or simply evil, has long fascinated and disturbed scholars, psychologists, and theologians alike. Was he a madman, overtaken by delusion and paranoia? Or was he coldly rational, fully aware of the horrors he was unleashing, and driven by a chilling moral vacancy? Understanding his mind is essential to addressing whether he was a demon in a metaphorical or psychological sense. Since his death, numerous mental health professionals have attempted to retroactively diagnose Adolf Hitler. While no formal diagnosis can be made without direct evaluation, several psychiatric theories have emerged based on biographical accounts, medical records, and witness testimonies. Hitler displayed classic symptoms of paranoid personality disorder, including deep suspicion of others, grandiose self-importance, and an obsessive need for control. His distrust of military commanders, his fear of betrayal, and his belief that Jews were conspiring to destroy Germany all point to delusional paranoia. He also exhibited traits of megalomania, an inflated sense of personal destiny, and godlike importance. He once stated, "I am now more than a man. I am a historical necessity." These delusions of grandeur intensified as the war progressed, culminating in his belief that if Germany failed him, it deserved to be destroyed, a chilling reflection of his nihilistic worldview. Several psychiatrists have classified Hitler as a psychopath or sociopath. Traits associated with these disorders include lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulativeness, and remorselessness, all of which Hitler demonstrated. In his personal relationships, Hitler was emotionally cold. He rarely expressed guilt or compassion. Even when ordering mass killings, he seemed completely detached from the human cost. His emotional distance from suffering was not a consequence of trauma, it was a feature of his personality. According to Dr. Walter Langer, who prepared a psychological profile of Hitler for the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, in 1943, Hitler exhibited pathological narcissism, hysterical tendencies, sadistic inclinations, obsession with control and power. The report concluded that Hitler was a neurotic psychopath with strong sexual repression and deep-rooted insecurity masked by fanatical ideology. Another critical factor in Hitler's mental state was his physical health and chronic drug abuse. His personal physician, Dr. Theodore Morell, administered daily injections of various substances including methamphetamines, barbiturates, opioids, cocaine via nasal treatments, hormones, and questionable tonics. By 1944, Hitler was reportedly addicted to several of these substances. His behavior, erratic mood swings, tremors, paranoia, and increasingly bizarre decisions may have been worsened by long-term drug-induced psychosis. Some historians suggest that this chemical dependency accelerated his mental and moral decline, possibly pushing an already disturbed mind into delirium and irrationality. His decision to fight a losing war to the bitter end, his delusions of German destiny, and his irrational military commands may be partly explained by this deteriorating state. Despite evidence of mental instability, Many scholars argue that Hitler was not insane in a clinical sense. He was strategic, intelligent, and deliberate. He outmaneuvered political opponents, orchestrated global war, and created a detailed genocidal infrastructure. These are not the actions of a raving lunatic, but of someone deeply calculating. This leads to a terrifying proposition echoed by philosopher Hannah Arendt in her work Eichmann in Jerusalem, the idea of the banality of evil. Evil, she argued, does not always come from monstrous madness. Sometimes it is ordinary, committed by people who believe they are simply doing their job or fulfilling a purpose. Hitler, then, may not have been mad, but morally annihilated, devoid of conscience and completely committed to a horrifying ideology. In this sense, the label demon becomes symbolic of chosen inhumanity, not imposed by madness, but by will. Though widely seen as cold and emotionless, Hitler did display moments of vulnerability, grief over his mother's death, affection for his dog Blondie, and emotional attachment to Eva Braun. Some use this to argue he wasn't pure evil, but these glimpses of normal emotion make his atrocities even more disturbing. They suggest that he retained the capacity for feeling, yet chose to exclude entire populations from his circle of empathy. He could show love, but only selectively, and only toward those viewed as worthy. This moral compartmentalization is a hallmark of dark personality structures. Love exists, but it is weaponized, conditional, and absent of universal compassion. The debate over whether Hitler was mentally ill or morally evil raises one of the oldest questions in philosophy. What is the nature of evil? If Hitler was mad, then perhaps he was not fully responsible for his actions, a dangerous idea, because it removes agency. But if he was sane, then he chose genocide, chose war, chose hate, and in doing so became something worse than mad. Many theologians and ethicists argue that Hitler represents a case of radical evil, the deliberate infliction of pain for ideological or personal satisfaction. Philosopher Immanuel Kant described radical evil as a corruption of the moral law within us, something done not out of ignorance or impulse, but out of a knowing embrace of destruction. In this sense, Hitler fits the profile of a demonic archetype not because he was out of control, but because he was entirely in control and still chose to destroy. Adolf Hitler was, by most psychological accounts, deeply disturbed. He showed signs of narcissism, paranoia, sadism, and possibly psychosis, all of which were magnified by his drug abuse and messianic ideology. Yet perhaps most disturbingly, he was also rational, cunning, and strategic. He understood power, manipulated emotion, and architected horror with chilling precision. Whether we see him as mentally ill or morally corrupted, the conclusion is the same. Hitler's mind was a breeding ground for monstrosity. If demons exist as forces of destructive will, then perhaps the most terrifying kind of demon is not an inhuman entity, but a man who, fully human, rejects humanity entirely. Long after his death in 1945, Adolf Hitler has continued to haunt the world's collective consciousness. Beyond his role in history, Hitler has become something more, a mythic symbol of absolute evil, a cautionary figure invoked to warn against tyranny, hate, and genocide. In many cultures and narratives, he is no longer viewed merely as a man, but as a demonic archetype, the embodiment of destruction, cruelty, and darkness. Among theologians, priests, and spiritual thinkers, Adolf Hitler is often discussed not just as a human being, but as a possible instrument of Satan. In Christian theology, Satan is viewed as the ultimate deceiver, a fallen angel whose mission is to corrupt God's creation. Many Christians see Hitler as a manifestation of that force. In sermons and religious texts, Hitler is frequently equated to the Antichrist, the prophesied tyrant who will deceive nations, lead them to ruin, and bring about apocalyptic suffering. This comparison arises not just from his atrocities, but from how he used charisma, deception, and godlike imagery to gain followers and destroy souls. Biblical passages, such as those in Revelation that speak of a beast who causes all nations to worship him, have been interpreted by some as eerily reflecting Hitler's rise and the cult of the Führer. In Jewish theology and Holocaust remembrance, Hitler is often remembered as the most destructive force in Jewish history. Rabbis and Jewish scholars have struggled to describe his evil in natural terms, with some turning to metaphysical explanations, seeing Hitler as a spiritual force of annihilation, sent to test, torment, or punish. In this context, Hitler becomes not just a murderer, but a destroyer of divine covenant, an agent of chaos not bound by human reason or morality. Over time, Hitler has transcended the history books to become a central figure in modern mythologies, particularly through film, literature, television, and internet culture. He is often dehumanized or supernaturalized, depicted not as a man, but as something alien, monstrous, or demonic. Hitler has appeared in countless films: Downfall, Valkyrie, Inglourious Bastards, Jojo Rabbit, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and Dead Snow, to name a few. In many portrayals, especially those in horror or fantasy genres, he is stylized as inhuman, often flirting with or embodying supernatural evil. In speculative fiction, Hitler is frequently shown dabbling in black magic, searching for occult artifacts, or being resurrected as a literal hellspawn. These portrayals are not just entertainment, they reflect a cultural effort to explain or distance ourselves from the scope of his crimes. In graphic novels and comics like Hellboy or Captain America, Hitler is often an ally of demonic forces or a demon himself. Even in internet culture, Hitler has become a demonized icon, used in memes and satire to represent absurdity, hatred, or cosmic-level evil. While this may seem humorous or even offensive, it also shows how deeply embedded he is in our symbolic understanding of malevolence. To invoke Hitler is to invoke ultimate evil, the worst-case scenario in politics, ethics, or philosophy. The term Hitler or Nazi is often used in arguments as a moral endpoint, a tactic sometimes called Godwin's Law, where any discussion eventually devolves into a comparison to Hitler to demonstrate extremity. Human beings have a deep psychological need to name, locate, and contain evil. In ancient times, societies created demons, devils, and monsters to explain unexplainable horrors, plagues, massacres, cruelty. In the 20th century, Adolf Hitler took on that role. By portraying Hitler as a demon, we give ourselves a way to frame the Holocaust and World War II as events caused by a singular, inhuman evil, rather than confronting the chilling reality that millions of ordinary people aided or ignored his crimes. The demonization of Hitler, then, becomes a form of cultural coping. In psychology, this is called externalization, projecting internal fear and guilt onto an external figure. By casting Hitler as evil incarnate, we distance ourselves from the systems, ideologies, and human behaviors that enabled him. It feels safer to say he was a monster than to admit he was human like us. The memory of Hitler is enshrined in Holocaust museums, genocide memorials, and educational systems across the world. These institutions do not merely preserve history, they present Hitler as a moral symbol, a living warning sign of what happens when hate, fear, and authoritarianism are allowed to grow unchecked. Quotes like "never again" are etched in stone next to images of Hitler, suggesting he is no longer just a historical figure, but a lesson, a ghost, and a moral compass pointing toward danger. In this way, the world has canonized Hitler into a role previously reserved for mythical evildoers, a universal symbol of ultimate wrong. His name alone conjures feelings of dread and disgust, far more than any other figure in modern history. While it may feel cathartic to view Hitler as a demon, some scholars caution against it. If we see him only as a supernatural monster, we risk absolving humanity of complicity. Hitler did not act alone. He rose because others followed. He ruled because others obeyed. He killed because others carried out his orders. By treating Hitler as otherworldly, we might fail to see how such evil can rise again not with horns and fire, but through words, laws, charisma, and fear. Thus, demonizing Hitler can be both necessary and dangerous. Necessary to emphasize the horror of his actions, but dangerous if it blinds us to the very human factors that created him. Adolf Hitler has become more than a man. He has become a myth, a monster, a moral metaphor. Across religions, media, and public memory, he is invoked as the ultimate evil, often depicted with traits traditionally reserved for demons or devils. This transformation reflects our psychological and cultural need to make sense of horror, to give evil a face, a name, and a shape. But in casting Hitler as a demon, we must not forget that he was also entirely human and that his legacy warns us not only of supernatural darkness, but of the evil that lives in ideology, silence, obedience, in the human heart. Adolf Hitler's crimes are universally regarded as among the worst in recorded history. However, he is not the only leader to have orchestrated mass killings, widespread suffering, or authoritarian regimes. Figures such as Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, and Leopold II of Belgium also left behind devastating legacies of genocide, torture, and repression. By exploring similarities and contrasts with other tyrants, we can better understand whether Hitler's evil was of a different nature, something beyond politics, something darker and more symbolic. Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist from the 1920s until his death in 1953. His policies of collectivization, forced famine, notably the Holodomor in Ukraine, purges, gulags, and show trials, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 20 million people. In terms of numbers alone, Stalin surpasses Hitler in lives lost. However, the nature of Stalin's atrocities was largely internal. Most victims were fellow Soviets. His evil was bureaucratic, cold, and systemic, characterized by paranoia and power consolidation, rather than racial ideology. While Stalin is seen as a monstrous dictator, he is not as universally demonized as Hitler. One reason may be that Stalin's crimes, though horrific, were framed within the ideology of class warfare, while Hitler's were based on racial extermination, which strikes deeper into the human conscience. Mao Zedong, founding father of the People's Republic of China, led campaigns like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution that caused widespread famine, mass executions, and the breakdown of traditional Chinese culture. Death estimates range from 30 to 45 million people. Mao, like Stalin, carried out policies under the banner of Marxist ideology, but with devastating consequences. Yet again, Mao is often discussed in terms of failed governance, ideological extremism, and authoritarian control, rather than pure malevolence. Unlike Hitler, Mao's actions lacked a symbolic, theatrical cruelty. Hitler's extermination camps, gas chambers, and medical experiments horrify not only because of the death toll, but because of their ritualistic sadism and ideological justification for murder. Pol Pot, leader of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, 1975 and Dane, 1979, engineered a campaign to create an agrarian utopia by eliminating intellectuals, city dwellers, and perceived enemies. Around 2 million Cambodians, a quarter of the population, were executed, starved, or worked to death. Pol Pot's regime was marked by insanity and isolationism. His atrocities are deeply disturbing, yet his name is not as globally infamous as Hitler's. One reason may be scale and symbolism. While Pol Pot's genocide was horrific, it lacked the global scope, media exposure, and ideological mythology that surrounded the Nazi regime. King Leopold II of Belgium ruled the Congo Free State as his personal property from 1885 to 1908. Under his reign, an estimated 10 million Africans died from forced labor, famine, disease, and mutilation. Workers who didn't meet rubber quotas had their hands cut off. Entire villages were burned. Leopold's crimes rival Hitler's in brutality, yet they are often overlooked in Western education. His evil was cloaked in the language of civilization and commerce, rather than militaristic or racial supremacy. He never gave speeches proclaiming his superiority. He simply committed quiet industrial genocide. Still, while Leopold was a monstrous colonialist, he did not become a symbol of ultimate evil, again highlighting that Hitler's evil is not only about numbers, but about intent, symbolism, and performance. Though others have killed more, or with equal cruelty, Hitler is remembered differently and far more demonically. Why? Hitler's genocide was not accidental, not collateral damage. It was intentional, planned, and framed as righteous. The Holocaust was systematic. Jews, Roma, Slavs, disabled individuals, and others were targeted not for their actions, but for existing. It was genocide as ideology, rooted in a belief in racial hierarchy and divine destiny. Hitler was a master of performance. His speeches were dramatic rituals. Nazi rallies resembled religious ceremonies. with symbols, fire, and music designed to provoke ecstasy and submission. He created a cult of personality so overwhelming that people saw him as a god or demon. This ritualization of violence, the symbolic use of fire, blood, flags, and ideology, made his evil almost liturgical, something resembling satanic ritual more than state policy. Hitler's actions plunged the world into war. He was not just a national tyrant, he was a global destroyer. World War II caused 70+ million deaths. The Holocaust reshaped international law, ethics, theology, and human rights discussions forever. He wasn't just a dictator, he was a harbinger of apocalypse, and history treats him accordingly. Hitler's name is now synonymous with absolute evil. Few historical figures become universal metaphors for moral failure. Even children, before learning full history, know Hitler as a term of horror. In moral philosophy, he has become the benchmark of immorality. Terms like Hitlerian or Nazi-like are used to describe acts of inhuman cruelty, radical extremism, or unchecked authoritarianism. Even when others are more evil by metrics, Hitler is more evil by meaning. He is not just a man in textbooks, he is a dark mirror held up to humanity's potential for destruction. If we step away from theology and ask secularly, was Hitler a demon? We might answer, no, he was worse. He was human, and in that humanity lies the true horror. It's easy to believe monsters do monstrous things. It's terrifying to realize humans do. Hitler shows us the abyss within us, how ideas, fear, charisma, and dehumanization can turn ordinary people into killers, and how one man can weaponize belief into annihilation. Compared to other brutal leaders, Adolf Hitler's evil stands out not merely in scale, but in intention, symbolism, and cultural impact. Others killed millions, but Hitler orchestrated genocide as a sacred mission and waged war with ritualistic fury. His crimes are memorialized, not forgotten, because they serve as a permanent warning. By comparing him with others, we don't diminish their crimes, but clarify his uniqueness. Hitler remains a singular figure not only in history, but in the mythos of evil, where he often replaces Lucifer as the devil we know, the one who wore a human face. The question, is Hitler really a demon, has taken us on a journey through history, philosophy, psychology, religion, and culture. We've examined the man himself, his ideology, and the devastating consequences of his actions. We've explored how Hitler's image has been demonized in both cultural memory and religious doctrine, how his crimes compare to other historical tyrants, and why he remains a universal symbol of evil. In the course of this investigation, we have encountered numerous facets of Hitler's persona and legacy, from his dehumanizing actions as a dictator to his near-mythical status as a symbol of absolute evil. The image of Adolf Hitler has transcended the realm of historical figure to become something darker and more profound. But in the end, the question remains, is Adolf Hitler really a demon? Or is he simply a man who became a monster, driven by ideology, fear, and ambition? To answer this question, we must look deeper at the symbolic significance of Hitler's actions and explore what it means to call him a demon. The concept of the demon in religious, philosophical, and cultural traditions is one that is usually associated with evil that exists outside of humanity. In many traditions, demons are supernatural beings, fallen angels, or otherworldly forces that prey on human weakness. A demon is something inherently different from a human, something that acts outside the bounds of reason and morality. Adolf Hitler, however, was very much a human being born, raised, and shaped by the social, political, and economic environment of his time. He was not a supernatural entity, nor was he born evil in any conventional sense. His journey from a failed artist to a dictator was marked by ideological obsession, manipulation, and a profound dehumanization of others. Yet in the way that Hitler's image has been mythologized and symbolized as pure evil, he has come to occupy a symbolic role akin to that of a demon. The very intensity and ruthlessness of his actions, combined with the spiritual language and moral absolute with which they were justified, has led to his transformation into a figure of cosmic malice, not merely a man, but a symbol of evil. It's important to understand why society has gone to such lengths to demonize Hitler. His crimes were not just crimes against individuals, but crimes against humanity. The Holocaust was systematic, ideologically driven, and scientifically rationalized. In a way, Hitler's policies and actions represented the absolute breakdown of human empathy and the rejection of morality in favor of a perverse vision of racial purity and supremacy. To dehumanize Hitler, to treat him as a creature of absolute evil, is, in many ways, a necessary step in processing the horror he unleashed. By removing him from the human category, we protect ourselves from the terrifying reality that he too was human. He represents an abyss that many would prefer to believe is unreachable, something alien and incomprehensible. In this sense, the demonization of Hitler is a psychological defense mechanism. It makes him otherworldly, a force that cannot be replicated in the human realm. This removal from humanity makes it easier to understand his actions as the exception, rather than the rule. Demonizing Hitler, however, carries risks. It creates a binary moral framework in which Hitler is the ultimate evil, and everything else is comparatively good. This reductionist view, while emotionally satisfying, overlooks the complexities of evil in human history. If we only view Hitler as a demon, we risk ignoring the deeper questions about how such a person could rise to power. How did so many people willingly follow him? How did he convince an entire nation to commit atrocities on an industrial scale? What does his evil tell us about the potential for evil in ourselves? By treating Hitler as an incomprehensible force of darkness, we may fail to grasp the ideological mechanisms, socio-political factors, and psychological dynamics that enabled his rise. In doing so, we prevent ourselves from learning the deeper, more uncomfortable lessons of his regime lessons that are still relevant today. As we've explored in the previous sections, while Hitler's actions were certainly catastrophic, he is not the only historical figure to have orchestrated mass death and suffering. Leaders such as Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, and Leopold II also carried out campaigns of genocide and terror. However, Hitler's unique position lies in his ability to combine ideology with mass violence in such a compelling and theatrical way. He was not merely a dictator enforcing order through fear and brutality. He was an ideological prophet, convincing millions that they were participating in a cosmic struggle for the survival of their race. While other tyrants may have been responsible for more deaths, Hitler's actions were framed not as political purges, but as a divinely ordained mission. The spiritual dimension, the vision of Nazi Germany as a new utopia, elevates his actions into something approaching sacrificial evil, akin to demonic worship. So is Hitler really a demon? The answer lies somewhere in between. As a man, Hitler was capable of evil, cruelty, and manipulation, but also vulnerable to the same psychological and social forces that shape all human beings. His actions were the result of a combination of personal ambition, ideological extremism, and the ability to exploit the fears and prejudices of others. As a monster, Hitler represents the darkest extremes of human potential. He was not only a dictator, he was the architect of an apocalyptic vision that sought to reshape the world through violence, terror, and racial purity. His actions were monstrous, not just in the scale of suffering, but in the calculation and coldness of their execution. As a demon, Hitler represents something more symbolic, a universal metaphor for evil. He is no longer just a man who lived and died, but a figure whose name is synonymous with absolute corruption, injustice, and suffering. He is a cultural symbol used to describe and warn against the horrors of unchecked hatred and totalitarianism. In this sense, Hitler's legacy is more than a historical fact. It is a moral lesson, a warning, and a reminder of the depths of evil that can emerge when ideology, power, and human vulnerability align in the most destructive of ways. In conclusion, while Hitler was undoubtedly a man who wreaked unimaginable horror on the world, the demonization of his legacy has given him a place in cultural memory as a symbol of ultimate evil. Whether we view him as a man, a monster, or a demon, his actions serve as a permanent reminder of the dangers of ideological extremism, authoritarianism, and unchecked hatred. As we move forward, we must remain vigilant, learning not only from the historical lessons of Hitler's reign, but from the cultural narratives we build around him. For in demonizing one figure, we risk overlooking the human factors that allow such evil to flourish in the first place. Understanding Hitler's humanity in all its horror is perhaps the most powerful way to prevent the same kind of evil from ever happening again.